What if I told you that the people who notice everything aren't gifted with some mysterious intuition, but are simply seeing what others are trying to avoid? We like to believe that awareness is something that some people are simply born with, as if it were a rare ability handed out unevenly at birth. It feels comforting to think that those who notice everything possess a kind of natural advantage, a quiet superpower that makes their lives clearer, easier, more meaningful. But awareness does not usually arrive as a gift wrapped in ease. More often, it is something that emerges slowly, almost reluctantly, shaped by circumstances that demanded attention long before attention felt safe or optional. It is less like a talent and more like a response, less like magic and more like memory. Awareness tends to grow in places where ignoring reality was never an option. It develops in the subtle tension of environments where what is said does not match what is felt, where silence carries weight, and where understanding what is happening beneath the surface becomes necessary for emotional survival. In such spaces, a person begins to observe not because they are curious, but because they must. They begin to notice tone, rhythm, small inconsistencies, the space between words, the shift in energy that others overlook. Over time, this constant observation stops feeling like effort and starts becoming instinctive, almost automatic, as if the mind learned to scan the world for meaning before it ever learned how to rest within it. What looks like sharp perception from the outside is often the result of repeated exposure to complexity. When someone has experienced confusion, contradiction, or emotional unpredictability, they begin to build an internal system that tries to make sense of it all. They pay attention to patterns, to behavior, to subtle cues that signal change or danger. Awareness becomes a way of creating stability in an unstable environment, a way of predicting what cannot be controlled. And while this ability can later appear refined, even admirable, it was not formed in comfort. It was shaped in moments that required vigilance, moments where understanding meant safety, and not understanding carried consequences. There is also a quiet weight that comes with this kind of awareness, because when you learn to see deeply, you do not just notice beauty or truth, you also notice tension, inconsistency, and unspoken discomfort. You begin to recognize when someone is pretending, when a connection has shifted, when something is being hidden behind a smile. This does not come from a desire to analyze or judge, but from a mind that has been trained to register details others ignore. Awareness, in this sense, is not selective. It does not turn on only when convenient. It is constant, persistent, and sometimes exhausting. And this is where the idea of awareness as a gift begins to fall apart. Because gifts are usually associated with pleasure, with ease, with something that enhances life without demanding too much in return. But awareness often demands presence, and presence is not always comfortable. To be aware means to confront reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. It means recognizing truths that cannot be softened, patterns that cannot be denied, and emotions that cannot be avoided. It requires a kind of honesty that can feel heavy, especially in a world that often encourages distraction and denial. So, awareness is not something that simply appears without reason. It is something that is built layer by layer through experiences that required attention, through moments that shaped perception, through the quiet decision repeated over time to look instead of look away. It is the consequence of having lived in a way that sharpened the senses, that deepened understanding, that made it impossible to ignore what lies beneath the surface. Sensitivity is often misunderstood as something delicate, almost fragile, as if it were a soft trait reserved for those who simply feel more than others without any clear reason. People tend to label it as a natural disposition, something inherent, something that exists without a past. But sensitivity rarely appears out of nowhere. It is not simply the result of being born with a deeper emotional range. More often, it is shaped over time, molded by experiences that demanded a heightened connection to feelings, both one's own and those of others. It is not a passive trait, but an active development formed in response to situations that required emotional awareness as a way to navigate reality. When someone becomes sensitive, it is usually because they have been exposed to environments where emotions carried significant weight, where subtle shifts in tone or behavior meant something important. In such spaces, feelings were not abstract concepts. They were signals, indicators, sometimes even warnings. A slight change in someone's voice could suggest tension, a pause in conversation could reveal discomfort, a forced smile could hide something deeper. Over time, a person learns to tune into these signals, not because they are searching for them, but because ignoring them was never truly an option. Sensitivity, in this sense, becomes a form of attention that has been sharpened by necessity. This kind of emotional awareness does not develop without cost. It often comes from moments where understanding others was tied to maintaining connection, avoiding conflict, or making sense of unpredictable behavior. A person learns to read emotions with precision because it helps them anticipate reactions, adjust their own responses, and create a sense of stability in situations that might otherwise feel overwhelming. What may later appear as empathy or emotional depth is often rooted in this early practice of observation, where feeling deeply was not a luxury, but a way of staying grounded in an uncertain environment. There is also a misconception that sensitivity is a sign of weakness, as if being affected by emotions means lacking strength or resilience. But in reality, sensitivity requires a significant level of internal engagement. It means allowing oneself to feel, to process, to remain open to experiences rather than shutting them out. It involves a willingness to stay connected to what is happening internally, even when it is uncomfortable. This kind of openness is not easy. It demands presence, patience, and the ability to sit with emotions without immediately trying to escape or suppress them. In many ways, sensitivity is not about being overwhelmed by feelings, but about being in constant dialogue with them. As sensitivity grows, it begins to extend beyond personal emotions and into the perception of others. A sensitive person does not only feel their own experiences more vividly, they also become attuned to the emotional landscapes of those around them. They notice when someone's words do not match their tone, when energy shifts in a conversation, when something remains unspoken yet strongly felt. This awareness does not come from a desire to analyze, but from a developed capacity to perceive emotional nuances. It is a skill that has been refined through repeated exposure to situations where understanding these nuances mattered. What makes sensitivity complex is that it does not come with an off switch. Once it has been developed, it continues to operate in the background, constantly picking up on details that others might overlook. It can make interactions richer, connections deeper, and experiences more meaningful, but it can also make it difficult to ignore tension, conflict, or emotional distance. Sensitivity, therefore, is not simply about feeling more, it is about perceiving more, about being aware of layers that are not immediately visible, about carrying an understanding that has been built through lived experience rather than innate design. There is a common assumption that people who notice everything must be constantly thinking, analyzing, or overprocessing the world around them. It appears from the outside as if their minds are always racing ahead, connecting dots faster than others, building conclusions in real time. But what often goes unnoticed is that their ability to perceive so much is not rooted in overthinking, but in presence. A kind of presence that is rare, quiet, and often misunderstood. It is not about doing more mentally, but about being more available to what is happening in the moment. To be deeply present means to engage fully with reality as it unfolds, without the constant need to escape into distractions or mental noise. It requires attention that is not fragmented, awareness that is not divided. While many people move through conversations thinking about what to say next, replaying what has already been said, or drifting into unrelated thoughts, those who notice everything tend to remain anchored in the present interaction. They listen not only to words, but to pauses, to shifts in tone, to the rhythm of speech. Their attention does not jump away. It stays, observes, absorbs. This kind of presence is not accidental. It is often cultivated, sometimes consciously, sometimes through circumstances that required it. When someone has learned that meaning exists beneath the surface, they begin to approach each moment with a different level of attention. They do not rush past details because they understand that details carry significance. A brief hesitation, a change in posture, a glance that lingers for a second longer than expected, these are not ignored. They are registered not as isolated events, but as parts of a larger pattern that reveals something deeper about the situation or the person involved. Being present also means being connected to one's own internal state while engaging with the external world. It involves noticing how something feels, not just what it looks like. When a conversation shifts in energy, a present person senses it immediately, not because they are searching for it, but because they are attuned to the moment. They are not numbing themselves, not distancing themselves, not rushing to conclusions. They are simply there, experiencing the interaction in real time, allowing information to reach them without interference. In a world filled with constant distractions, this level of presence becomes even more distinct. Many people are physically present but mentally elsewhere, divided between multiple streams of thought, notifications, and internal dialogues. Attention becomes scattered, and with it, the ability to perceive subtle details diminishes. When awareness is fragmented, perception becomes shallow, but when attention is focused and grounded, perception deepens naturally, not because effort increases, but because interference decreases. There is also a certain stillness that comes with deep presence. It is not the absence of thought, but the absence of unnecessary noise. This stillness allows observation to happen without distortion. Instead of projecting assumptions or filling gaps with speculation, a present person allows situations to reveal themselves gradually. They do not rush to label or categorize. They watch, they listen, they feel. This patience creates space for clarity, for understanding that is not forced but discovered. What appears as the ability to notice everything is often the result of this sustained, undivided attention. It is not about scanning the environment for clues, but about being so engaged with the moment that nothing important slips by. Presence becomes the foundation upon which perception is built, shaping the way reality is experienced and understood, allowing details to emerge naturally without being chased or constructed artificially. There is a subtle but powerful habit that shapes how people experience reality, and it often goes unnoticed because it feels normal. It is the tendency to look away when something becomes uncomfortable, to soften what feels too sharp, to replace what is real with what feels easier to accept. This quiet avoidance does not always appear as denial. Sometimes it shows up as distraction, as rationalization, as the constant search for explanations that make things more convenient than they truly are. In this process, truth does not disappear, but it becomes blurred, hidden behind layers of interpretation that protect rather than reveal. Those who begin to notice everything are often the ones who have, at some point, reduced this habit of escape. Not completely, because no one is entirely free from it, but enough to allow reality to come through with less distortion. They have learned, sometimes through necessity, that avoiding what is uncomfortable does not eliminate it. It only delays the moment of recognition. And so, instead of turning away, they remain present with what is difficult, allowing it to exist without immediately trying to reshape it into something more acceptable. Truth, in this sense, is not something that needs to be actively searched for in dramatic ways. It is already present in every interaction, in every emotion, in every inconsistency between what is said and what is felt, but it becomes visible only when the impulse to escape is softened. When a person stops filtering reality through constant avoidance, details begin to emerge more clearly. A conversation reveals more than its surface meaning. A relationship shows its actual dynamics rather than its idealized version. Emotions become signals rather than inconveniences to suppress. There is a certain courage involved in this process, though it is not always recognized as such. To face truth means to risk discomfort, to allow clarity to replace illusion, to accept that not everything aligns with what one might prefer to believe. This does not require dramatic actions or confrontations. It often happens quietly, in small moments where a person chooses to acknowledge what they feel instead of dismissing it, to recognize a pattern instead of excusing it, to see a situation as it is rather than as it was hoped to be. These moments accumulate, gradually reshaping perception. As this pattern continues, awareness deepens in a natural way. It does not feel forced or analytical. It feels direct. When someone speaks, their words are heard, but so is the tone beneath them. When an environment shifts, the change is sensed without needing to be explained immediately. Truth becomes something that presents itself through observation rather than something that needs to be extracted through effort. The more a person reduces their tendency to escape, the more accessible this clarity becomes. At the same time, this clarity can bring a certain weight, because when truth is no longer filtered out, it becomes difficult to ignore inconsistencies, to overlook misalignment, to remain unaware of what is happening beneath the surface. What once could be easily dismissed now stands out more distinctly. This does not come from a desire to find problems, but from a reduced tolerance for distortion. When reality is allowed to be seen as it is, without constant modification, it naturally reveals both its simplicity and its complexity. The process of stopping escape is not about forcing oneself to confront everything at once. It is about gradually becoming more willing to remain with what is present, even when it challenges comfort. It involves noticing when the mind begins to shift away from something and gently returning attention to it, allowing understanding to develop without immediate judgment. Over time, this practice changes the way perception functions, making it less dependent on avoidance and more aligned with what is actually there, allowing truth to surface in its own way through attention that is no longer divided between reality and the need to avoid it. Emotional intelligence is often described in simple terms as the ability to understand and manage emotions, both personal and interpersonal. But beneath this definition lies something much more intricate and transformative. Emotional intelligence does not merely help people navigate feelings, it fundamentally changes the way reality is perceived. It refines attention, deepens awareness, and allows individuals to recognize layers of meaning that would otherwise remain hidden. It is not just about feeling more or reacting better, but about seeing more clearly through the lens of emotional understanding. When a person develops emotional intelligence, they begin to notice that emotions are not random or isolated experiences. They are signals, responses to internal and external stimuli that carry information about needs, boundaries, values, and connections. Instead of dismissing feelings as distractions or inconveniences, they start to treat them as data. This shift in perspective creates a more attentive relationship with emotional experiences, allowing subtle changes to be recognized rather than ignored. A slight discomfort in a conversation, a sense of unease in a situation, or a feeling of distance in a relationship becomes something to observe, not something to suppress. This internal awareness naturally extends outward. As someone becomes more familiar with their own emotional patterns, they develop a greater capacity to recognize similar patterns in others. They begin to understand how emotions manifest through tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, and even silence. What might seem like ordinary behavior to some becomes rich with meaning to those who are emotionally attuned. A pause before answering a question, a shift in posture during a conversation, or a change in energy when a particular topic arises all become noticeable elements that contribute to a deeper understanding of what is happening beneath the surface. Emotional intelligence also enhances the ability to distinguish between what is being expressed and what is being experienced. People do not always communicate their true feelings directly. Words can be chosen carefully, filtered through social expectations, or shaped by the desire to avoid vulnerability. However, emotions often reveal themselves indirectly through inconsistencies between what is said and how it is said. A person may claim to be fine while their tone suggests otherwise, or they may express agreement while their body language indicates hesitation. Emotional intelligence allows these discrepancies to be perceived without immediately jumping to conclusions, creating space for a more nuanced interpretation of the situation. Another important aspect of emotional intelligence is regulation, the ability to remain grounded while processing emotional information. Without this stability, heightened awareness could easily become overwhelming. But when emotions are understood and managed effectively, they become tools rather than obstacles. A person can notice tension without becoming consumed by it, recognize sadness without losing clarity, and observe conflict without reacting impulsively. This balance allows perception to remain sharp and focused rather than distorted by unprocessed emotional responses. As emotional intelligence deepens, perception becomes less reactive and more intentional. Instead of interpreting situations based on assumptions or past experiences alone, individuals begin to respond to what is actually present. They develop the ability to pause, to observe, to consider multiple perspectives before forming conclusions. This creates a more accurate understanding of reality, one that is not clouded by immediate emotional reactions or unconscious biases. It is a way of seeing that is both sensitive and grounded, capable of capturing complexity without becoming lost in it. This sharpening of perception does not happen instantly. It is the result of continuous engagement with emotional experiences, both pleasant and difficult. It requires a willingness to reflect, to learn from interactions, and to remain open to the evolving nature of human behavior. Over time, emotional intelligence transforms perception into something more refined, allowing details to emerge with greater clarity and connections to be understood with deeper insight, shaping a way of seeing that integrates feeling and awareness into a cohesive and perceptive understanding of the world. Perception is often treated as something objective, as if what we see is simply what exists, independent of our internal world. But perception is never entirely neutral. It is shaped, filtered, and influenced by what we are ready to acknowledge and what we instinctively avoid. Two people can observe the same situation and come away with completely different understandings, not because the reality itself has changed, but because their willingness to face certain aspects of it differs. What is visible is not only determined by what is present, but also by what is allowed to be seen. There is a quiet negotiation that happens within the mind when encountering reality. Certain details are accepted easily because they align with existing beliefs, expectations, or comfort zones. Others create tension, challenge assumptions, or evoke discomfort, and in response, they are softened, reinterpreted, or ignored altogether. This process is rarely conscious. It unfolds automatically, shaping perception in subtle ways. A person might overlook signs of dishonesty because accepting them would disrupt a relationship, or they might ignore their own dissatisfaction because confronting it would require change. In both cases, the reality is present, but it remains partially unseen. Those who begin to notice everything often have a different relationship with this internal filtering. It is not that they lack biases or defenses, but they gradually reduce the distance between what is there and what they allow themselves to perceive. They become more willing to sit with contradictions, to acknowledge discomfort, to let reality present itself without immediately adjusting it to fit a more comfortable narrative. This shift does not happen suddenly. It develops through repeated moments where facing truth, even in small ways, becomes more tolerable than avoiding it. Willingness plays a crucial role in this process. It is not enough for something to be visible externally. There must also be an internal openness to receive it. When a person is unwilling to face a particular truth, their perception adjusts to protect them. They might rationalize behavior, reinterpret intentions, or focus on less threatening details. This is not a failure of intelligence, but a function of psychological protection. The mind prioritizes stability, even if that stability comes at the cost of clarity. As long as something feels too difficult to confront, perception will continue to bend around it. However, when willingness increases, perception expands. A person begins to notice patterns they previously overlooked, to recognize emotions they once dismissed, to understand dynamics that were once confusing. This does not mean that reality becomes harsher, it becomes more complete. There is less distortion, less selective attention, and more direct engagement with what is actually present. Situations are seen in their full complexity, not just in the parts that feel safe or convenient. This expanded perception also brings a deeper sense of responsibility, because when you see more clearly, it becomes harder to remain passive. Awareness invites response, even if that response is internal. Recognizing a misalignment, a truth, or a pattern creates a kind of tension that calls for acknowledgement. It is no longer possible to claim ignorance because the information is now visible. This does not always lead to immediate action, but it changes the way a person relates to their own experience. What emerges from this process is a form of perception that is closely tied to honesty, not an abstract or moralized honesty, but a practical one rooted in the willingness to see what is there without excessive distortion. It is an ongoing process, not a fixed state, shaped by the continuous interplay between reality and the courage to face it, allowing perception to become a reflection not just of the external world, but of the internal readiness to engage with it without turning away.